communicate, to store information, to distribute information, to interpret information. All of that that's technology already. The book is already technology. The scroll is already technology. And that's a certain kind of media studies approach that I imbibed through McLuhan and his influences. And then I was like, well, great. Well, then what happens? So if the basic thesis is like, well, if these media are media, they also mediate the spirit, gods, religious practices, mystical experiences, even sort of illuminating language, the sort of mystical poetry, or those illuminating moments when books become more than just repositories of knowledge, but actually open up and transmit something, that kind of magical feeling that all readers know, and that's very true in the history of religions. That if these physical media can transmit this religious material, well, what happens when we subject them to technological criticism? And more importantly, what happens when they change? And so, for me, for the book, the first chapter is really looking at the literary world, the world of writing and text and scrolls. The second one is then what happens when electricity enters into communication. So when we invent the telegraph, or Samuel Morse invents the telegraph in the middle of the 19th century, it's not just that there's a new clever communications device. It's that the whole world, the material forces associated with electricity and electromagnetism cross with human communication. And so when that gets spiritualized, that's a new thing. We need new tools, new media understandings of how these new technologies change the religious and occult dimension of writing, of earlier forms of communication technology. So let's just keep going forward. Radio, television, and then up into the computer. So that was the sort of overall historical, framework. And one of the things that I noticed is the pattern that when a new technology of communication enters the scene, starting at the very least with the telegraph, immediately afterwards, there's this explosion of utopian energy. This was going to save the world. We're going to understand one another. We're going to be able to transform education. And you see this boom, radio, boom, television, boom, and so from that historical point of view, I was ready for techno-utopian hype, because it just kind of goes along with the territory where there's a new media opens up spaces of novelty, of undetermined, of non-striated possibilities. And so, of course, some of them you get to see the latent utopianism and the hopes that people still have. So you could watch that. And I was sort of watching that unfold in the 1990s, specifically with computers. And then I went in and looked at more contemporary, at the time, sort of subfields of the kind of new technology, mystical space. So I looked at UFOs. I looked at the metaphor of magic in computer games and in hacking, and why magic is such a good metaphor for computer space. And then at the end, I looked at some of the apocalyptic and millennialist implications, both the sort of hopes for a Gaian mind and a transformed global consciousness, as well as the dark side, or the dystopian or the paranoid side of that, where suddenly we're inside of some demonic antichrist system where everything is controlled. And so it's like two sides of the same coin. And, that really, it's, and all that stuff is still here. In fact, in some ways, it's even more visible. So I was able to tap into, I think, abiding dreams and potentials and actual forces that continue. So it's surprisingly undated, even though there's nothing about social media. There's nothing about social media or stuff that we would recognize. So it was a really interesting ride. The title, though, I must say, is sort of intentionally ambiguous, in the sense that I've had people go, "Is that a disease?" And I'm like, yeah, in some ways it is. It's like an old problem, the Gnostic problem, the dualist problem, in the sense of that's one of the ways that Gnosticism has historically functioned in religious discourse is as a signifier for a radical Manichaean dualism of body and soul, or earth and the alien God. And that's often how it's been used sort of in a derogatory way, as opposed to the more complex form of dualism that Orthodox Christianity represents. So in some ways, I'm saying, yeah, technology actually brings back that really hardcore spirit versus body, information versus matter kinds of thinking that will also have a spiritual or mythological effect. And so when like the Matrix movie came out after I wrote my book, I was like, ding, it was like, here you go, kids. And so then my next afterward, I'm like, look at the Matrix. See, I wasn't just like being a goofball. Because when I wrote this book, most of the people I know who were around me at the time in the 90s were like, I don't know, man, that might not really, I don't know what you're doing there. That sounds a little bit weird, but I as I said, it was a bit of a transmission. So I kind of had to go forward with that. So on the one hand, TechGnosis is sort of a warning about the way that technology and digital technology in particular kind of erodes the culture of matter, and it erodes embodiment, erodes the sense of relationality of being embedded in an environment and stuff, all of which I think is pretty obvious and true and widely recognized. But at the same time, I know that gnosis is a very ambivalent term, and that if we are going to talk about mystical experience as something that's part of the world, part of human possibility, part of culture, even if we can't quite define what it is, and maybe mysticism isn't the right word, maybe occult is better, maybe illumination. I mean, all of these words are only going to be partial, or going east, in the traditions I've learned, Satori or Kensho, or, there's other terms for this kind of possibility that we carry within us. And my approach has always been to be very radically open to those kinds of possibilities in a way that limits my own pessimism, my own criticality, and hopefully creates a certain kind of generosity towards the possibilities of religious experience, even when they're bizarre, or they end up being pathological. There's something in there. So I'm also kind of open to what does it mean? What is that Gnostic call? And particularly, and then maybe this is the final thing I'll say, is that in one way, what TechGnosis was doing beyond the story about media machines and popular mythology was it was reminding everyone that we have never been modern, that whether you call it enchantment or you call it religion or you call it a desire for gnosis or desire for transcendence, that those elements of the human being, or at least in the West, that we can get in a conversation about whether they're universal or not, that's not really the point. They don't go away with the rise of science and technology and capitalism and industry and modern technology. They just don't. And scholars will look at this, it's totally clear. The whole idea that the modernity is about disenchantment is only one part of the story, and the whole story is much richer and more complex than that. So in a way, I was just saying, look, if there was going to be a vehicle of rationality, bureaucracy, algorithmic control that was going to avoid enchantment, it was going to be these technologies, because obviously they're products of reason, they're products of modernity, they're products of industrial capacity and education, but they're not. In fact, they're crazy. So it's like there's no way out of wrestling with gods and myths and spiritual longings. They just get translated, masked, repressed, break out again, and I'm a enlightenment guy in a lot of ways. I'm a fan of criticality. I'm a fan of history. I'm a fan of understanding things analytically, but I also recognize there's a limit there. And so I wanted to kind of write on the edge of that limit in a way that made the book not just a critical book, but a book that had sort of seeds of some of these enigmas in it. So it's like you kind of pick it up a little bit. So it's also more like I absorbed some of the memes and allowed them to kind of live their own lives through the text in a way that makes it more enchanting. Just as a writer, I like to do, but I think it's actually a more honest way to be a critic in a lot of ways as well. And I think that's partly why people like it, is that there's a sense of, there's still a sense of mystery in it, even if it's mostly critical and analytic.
Thank you so much for this. I often, Joel knows this, I often tell my students that according to me, at least, good scholarship is a scholarship that is clear, not only in what it wants to say, but what it wants to do, right? And embraces, so to speak, the performative effects, even perlocutionary effects, and, what emotions we want to trigger. And you were so clear on this. And you really, I really appreciate it. You're being so clear with, with this particular point. Joel, do you want to step in? Do you have any questions, about TechGnosis? I know you're a fan of the book.
I am. I do have questions. Dr. Davis, first, it's just delightful to have you visiting virtually and be part of this conversation. So thank you. So as we sort of touched on, I'm solidly millennial, born 1989. And I vaguely have memories of a time before the internet. I have memories of dial-up and what that looked like in my own life trajectory. But I'm curious, there's this sort of nostalgia for people my generation and younger of this era, this techno-utopian era, movies like Johnny Mnemonic and Hackers and then The Matrix. And so I'm just curious, what do you think is important from this moment in time when you wrote TechGnosis for younger generations to know about?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't have a set answer, because for me, it is an enigma, in the sense that especially as one ages, you start to kind of recognize, I think it's easier to recognize the way that you're generationally located, because how like I'll speak for me, my sensibility is increasingly anachronistic. And then you start to realize, oh, that's what this sensibility is. So for me, I am in the last generation in the developed world of the analog. So I call that feeling, I call it the analog sunset, where I grew up TV, none of this stuff. And then I watched it grow. And I can remember early encounters with computers because of my father at work and And it's a very rich part of my life. And I was always very aware of them, very aware of what was going on, that there was something new here, that this needed to be paying attention to. And at the same time, I'm also a very analog guy, hence all the vinyl, and so I'm in that, and I'm very aware that sensibility conditions my experience. And I think it also conditioned the 90s culture, because in a way, what you're looking at with 90s culture is another version of what I had talked about a moment ago, which is really the first time that I won't say not mainstream, but really kind of subculture at large encountered the novelty and the actual, communicational potentials, but also the sort of fantasy space of the digital as a distinctly new development in the history of media technology, with its own sensibility, its own qualities that are in contrast to the analog. And one way of thinking about that time period is that, the counterculture never goes away. The counterculture from the 60s, let's say, to the mid 70s sort of hits it runs aground, and it's not going to be the revolution. It's not going to be, we are all going to transform the world. But what happens is it doesn't just sell out and go into 1980s Wall Street conservatism and Reaganism. What it does is it goes underground and it breaks apart into all of these subcultures. So then you get these sort of subcultures and undergrounds and punk rock and the Church of the Subgenius and, the beginnings of indie rock and industrial culture and Gothic culture, all these weirdos, anarchists, psychedelics don't go away. The Grateful Dead is very popular. So you have all these undergrounds. And then in the late 80s and the early 90s, they discover the digital. And so they're able to bring in this novelty, creativity, sense of edginess, but also they recognize how incredibly powerful this space is. And they have the naivete to not consider all of the consequences, not think about how this might actually work out in a world of advanced extractive capitalism. They can, in a way, afford their naivete, whatever that means. And I think part of the difficulty, and so I personally wrestled, so this was sort of my time, like my 60s was the early to mid 90s, before the web really took off and started to go, it's just that period was really wonderful, very interesting time culturally, whatever. But I'm still wrestling with it. And like other thoughtful people in my generation are wrestling with it, because there is a kind of naivete in it that makes it a little tough to just sort of get behind. And so you're not really sure what to do with it. Is it like, oh, wow, they were lucky them, they got to be naive and enjoy all the goofiness and not have to, deal with social media mobs or advanced, all these kind of